He said it the way you'd mention the weather. I've met someone, and I'm leaving. 24 years of marriage, and that was the whole sentence. No tremor in his voice. No tears. Just my husband, Daniel, standing in the kitchen we'd painted together 3 summers ago, telling me our entire life was over while the kettle I'd just switched on began to hiss behind him. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I wasn't a woman who missed things. I'm a bus driver. I spend my days watching mirrors, reading the road, anticipating the idiot who's going to pull out without indicating. My whole working life is built on noticing what's coming before it arrives. And I never saw this coming. Not once. Not a single flicker of warning in 24 years. We met when we were both 23. I was working the late routes back then, and Daniel used to catch my bus home from his shift to the supermarket. Same seat, second row by the window. He'd nod at me in the mirror every night for about a month before he finally worked up the nerve to stay on past his stop just so he could talk to me at the depot. He was so nervous his ears went red. I thought it was the sweetest thing I'd ever seen. We were married within 2 years. We weren't wealthy people. I want to be honest about that because later when I tried to make sense of it all, I kept reaching for explanations that would have made it understandable. Money, status, some glittering life he was running toward. But there was none of that. He stocked shelves and worked the tills at Waitrose. I drove buses. We rented a leasehold flat on the 3rd floor with a radiator that knocked in the winter and a view of the car park. We had a son, Oliver, who was 20 now, and we had each other, and for 24 years, I genuinely believe that was enough for both of us. Our marriage was good. I need you to hear that because everyone assumes there must have been cracks. There weren't. We were kind to each other. We still laughed. We still reached for each other in the dark, and I'm not going to be coy about it. We had a fulfilling, affectionate life together right up until the end. He'd bring me tea in bed on my early shifts. I'd iron his work shirts and tuck a little note into the pockets sometimes, just something daft to make him smile when he found it. That was us. That was the whole architecture of my life, and I never doubted a single beam of it. So when he said the words in that flat, ordinary voice, my first reaction wasn't even pain. It was confusion. I actually laughed. I said, "What do you mean you've met someone?" Met someone where? Because in my head it didn't compute. It was like he told me the sky was a different color now. The kettle clicked off behind him. The silence that followed, it was the loudest thing I have ever heard. At the salon, he said. By your gym. The salon. By my gym. I need to explain how grotesque that detail was because it took me a full week to understand the shape of it. There's a hair salon right next door to the gym where I'd had a membership for years. And once, Daniel had come to pick me up after class because my car was in for its MOT. He'd parked outside, waiting. And in those 10 minutes, somehow, he'd met her. A trainee hairdresser, late 20s. Younger than our son's older friends. A woman who'd been a child while Daniel and I were buying our first sofa. Her name's Chloe, he said as if I'd asked. As if I'd want her name living in my head for the rest of my life. We're going to get married. After the divorce, I sat down at the kitchen table because my legs had stopped agreeing to hold me up. Married. He hadn't said we're seeing how things go or I need some time. He'd already planned the whole next chapter, cast the new lead, set the date in his mind. While I'd been packing his lunches and folding his socks, he'd been auditioning my replacement and finding her superior in every way that apparently mattered to a man I no longer recognized. How long, I asked. My voice came out very small. How long has this been going on? He didn't answer that one properly. He looked at the floor and mumbled something about a while, and it just happened, and I didn't plan for it. And every word was a little knife because there is no version of a while that doesn't mean he came home to me, ate the dinner I'd made, kissed me goodnight, and lay in our bed with the smell of her still on him. There is no innocent length of time. And while meant months of lies stacked on top of each other like bricks, and I'd been living inside the house he'd built out of them without ever knowing the walls weren't real. He packed 2 bags that night. I sat on the edge of our bed and watched him fold his shirts into a suitcase. The same shirts I'd ironed, the same little notes probably still in some of the pockets. And I couldn't make myself move or speak. He took his toothbrush from the holder where it had stood next to mine for 24 years. That's the image that haunts me, if you want to know the truth. Not the big dramatic things. The toothbrush holder with one empty slot. Such a small, stupid, devastating thing. Our son came home from his shift to find his father carrying suitcases down the stairs. Oliver stood in the doorway, keys still in his hand, and looked between the two of us. Me on the stairs with my face wrecked, his dad with the bags, and I watched my boy work it out in real time. He was 20, old enough to understand everything, young enough that I'd have given anything to protect him from it. "Dad," he said. "Dad, what are you doing?" Daniel couldn't even look at him. That was the moment I felt the first real flash of anger underneath the shock. Not for myself, but for Oliver. Our son said, "You're not seriously leaving." And his father just kept walking toward the door, and Oliver's voice cracked the way it hadn't since he was 12. "You're leaving, Mum? For who?" And when Daniel mumbled the answer, when the truth came out about who and how young and how long, I watched something close in my son's face that I don't think has fully opened back up since. The door shut. The flat went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Oliver came and sat next to me on the stairs and put his arm around me. And it should have been the other way round. I should have been comforting him, but I had nothing left to give in that moment. We just sat there in the dark stairwell, the two of us, while downstairs a car door slammed and an engine started and the man we both loved drove away to begin his new life. I'd love to tell you that was rock bottom. It wasn't. The cruelest part was still waiting for me. It arrived about 3 weeks later in a doctor's surgery under fluorescent lights that made everyone look ill. I'd not been feeling right. Run down, I thought, from the stress and the not sleeping and the forgetting to eat. I went to the GP expecting to be told I was exhausted and grieving and needed to look after myself. Instead, the doctor, a kind woman about my own age, sat very still after she read my results and chose her words with the careful gentleness people use right before they hand you something heavy. She told me I had a sexually transmitted infection. I remember the room tilting. I remember saying, "That's not possible," because I've been faithful for 24 years and there was only one person on earth who could have given it to me. And then I remember the exact, sickening second when the maths completed itself in my head. He hadn't just been unfaithful in his heart. He'd been with her, with Chloe, and then he'd come home and been with me. And somewhere in all of that, he'd brought this thing into my body without a word of warning. He'd known. He had to have known something was wrong with himself. And he'd let me carry on, exposed and ignorant, sharing a bed with a man who was quietly poisoning the one thing I never doubted was honest between us. That was the betrayal that broke something fundamental in me. The affair was a wound to my heart. But this was contempt. This was a man who looked at me across the dinner table every night, knowing and decided my health, my body, my right to know was simply less important than not having an uncomfortable conversation. I drove home from that surgery, and I had to pull the car over on a residential street and just sit there shaking, gripping the wheel, because I genuinely did not know how a person was supposed to keep breathing through a thing like that. What would you have done in this situation? I've turned it over 1,000 times. Whether I should have phoned him screaming, whether I should have told his family, whether I should have shown up at that salon. Let me know in the comments, because to this day, I'm not sure there was a right way to survive that particular afternoon. I didn't do any of those things in the end. I told Oliver because he had a right to know what kind of man his father had become, and watching my son's face when I told him is another thing I'll never unsee. He went very white and very quiet, and then he said, "I'm never speaking to him again," and he has more or less kept that promise. A 20-year-old shouldn't have to make a choice like that about his own dad. But Daniel made the choice for him, really. You don't get to do what he did and still expect to keep everyone's love. Love isn't unconditional in the way people pretend. It can be spent. He spent hours. The weeks after that blurred together into a gray smear. I went to work because I had to. Buses don't drive themselves, and I couldn't afford to lose my income, especially not with the divorce coming. So I put on my uniform and drive my route and smile at the regulars and call out the stops. And the whole time, there'd be this hollow roaring in my chest, this sense that I was a hologram of a person going through the motions while the real me lay collapsed somewhere I couldn't reach. People would get on my bus and have no idea that the woman taking their fare had been gutted like a fish 3 weeks earlier and was simply too stubborn to fall down. The divorce itself was slow. Daniel had filed. He'd done that, too, taken even the decision of ending it out of my hands, and the legal machinery ground forward at its own glacial pace over the following months. I got myself a solicitor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ruth who treated me with a brisk kindness that I came to rely on. At our second or third meeting, after I'd been sitting across from her struggling not to cry while we talked through the financials, she set down her pen and looked at me properly. "Can I suggest something that isn't legal advice?" she said. I nodded. "I'd like you to consider seeing a counselor. I recommend it to a lot of my clients, especially the ones who were left rather than the ones who did the leaving. There's a particular kind of damage to being the one who didn't choose this. It helps to have somewhere to put it that isn't your son and isn't your friends." I felt my face go hot. I said something about being fine, about coping, about not really being the sort of person who talks to strangers about their feelings. But she just nodded like she'd heard that exact protest 100 times and slid a card across the desk anyway. I put it in my purse, and I genuinely thought I'd never use it. The idea of sitting in a room and saying out loud everything that had happened, saying the word infection, saying he chose a child over me, saying I still love him, which was the most shameful truth of all. It made me feel sick with embarrassment. I didn't even like talking about the divorce with the people who already knew. How was I supposed to lay it all out for a stranger? Because that's the thing nobody warns you about. The shame. Logically, I knew none of it was my fault. Everyone told me so. My friends, my colleagues, my sister on the phone every Sunday saying, "You did nothing wrong, love." And I believed them in my head. But shame doesn't live in your head. It lives somewhere lower and older. And it kept whispering to me that a woman whose husband leaves her after 24 years must have failed at something. Must have let herself go, or stopped being interesting, or missed the warning signs a better wife would have caught. It was a lie. But it was a lie that knew my voice and used it against me at 3 a.m. every single night. I had a colleague at the depot, Sandra, who'd been through her own version of this maybe a decade before me. Her husband had also left for someone younger. When mine happened, she sought me out in the break room one morning, put a cup of tea in front of me, and said, "Well, welcome to the First Wives Club, love." I'd never heard the phrase before. She said it with this wry, knowing little smile, not unkind at all, more like one survivor recognizing another. I didn't really understand it then. I just knew I was a member of something I'd never asked to join, a club with terrible entry requirements and no way to resign. The months crawled. Autumn became winter. The flat that had once been ours became just mine, except it never felt like mine. It felt like a museum of a marriage, every object an exhibit. His side of the wardrobe stayed empty for ages because I couldn't bear to spread my things into it. The empty space felt more honest than filling it would have. I kept the flat too warm and slept badly and lost weight I didn't have to lose, and I told everyone I was doing fine, and I was lying to every single one of them. There were days, I'll be honest, because I think honesty is the only thing this story is good for. There were days I didn't want to be here anymore. Not in a planning way, in a tired way. A way where you wake up and the weight of having to be a person all day feels like more than you can lift, and some quiet corner of your mind wonders whether it would be so terrible to simply stop. I'm telling you this not for sympathy, but because if anyone listening is in that gray, hollowed-out place, I want them to know that someone else stood exactly there, gripping the kitchen counter at 6 a.m. and made it out the other side. It is survivable. It does not feel survivable, but it is. What kept me going mostly was Oliver. He'd check in on me constantly, my boy, calling on his breaks, coming round with a takeaway, sitting on the sofa with me through the bad evenings without needing me to perform being okay. He was so angry with his father, and I worried about that anger, about what it was doing to him to carry it. But he was also so tender with me. One night, he found me crying over an old photo, and he didn't say, "Don't cry, Mom." He just sat down and looked at the photo with me and said, "He doesn't get to take all of it." The good years still happened. They were still real. And I clung to that. The good years were real. Daniel's leaving didn't make 24 years of love retroactively fake. It just meant the man who'd lived them had become someone who could throw them away. Then came the day everything turned at once. My solicitor had warned me it would happen this way, that the divorce would be finalized on a particular date, and by some miserable coincidence of timing and bad luck with the rental market, that was also the day I was moving out of the old flat and into a new one. So I spent the morning of the worst day with cardboard boxes and a hired van, carrying 24 years of life down 3 flights of stairs, and at some point during the lifting and the taping and the labeling, a notification came through on my phone that the divorce was official. That was it. That was the sound my marriage made when it finally died. A little buzz from a phone and a flat full of boxes. The new place was small and a bit shabby and entirely mine. I sat on the floor of the empty living room that first night, surrounded by boxes I hadn't the energy to open, eating chips out of the paper because I hadn't found the plates yet, and I cried, but it was a slightly different kind of crying than before. Underneath the grief, there was the faintest, strangest thread of something else. Not happiness. Nowhere near happiness. But maybe the very first atom of a feeling that this space, however sad, was a space he couldn't touch. There was no empty slot in this bathroom's toothbrush holder because there'd never been a second toothbrush here at all. There was nothing here to be missing. It was a small mercy, but I took it. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every day. And if you've ever had to rebuild a life from the floor of an empty room, you'll understand exactly what came next, because the day after I moved in, I had to do the hardest thing of all. The day after the move, I had my first appointment with the counselor. Ruth's card had been sitting in my purse for months, but Oliver and my sister and even Sandra had all worn me down about it, gently and persistently, until I finally rang the number. I was more nervous about that appointment than I'd been about the divorce hearing itself. I sat in my car outside the building for 10 minutes with the engine off, telling myself I could just drive away and reschedule, that nobody would know. But I'd run out of toothbrush holders to hide behind. So I went in. Her name was Helen. She was older than me, with kind gray eyes, and a small room with 2 soft chairs and a box of tissues placed, I noticed, within easy reach, which told me everything about what usually happened in that room. She didn't push. She just asked me gently why I'd come. And I opened my mouth to give her the tidy summary, the version I gave everyone. My husband left me. I'm finding it difficult. And instead, the whole thing came pouring out of me. The kettle, the toothbrush, the salon by the gym, Chloe, the doctor's surgery, and the results slid across the desk. A while, Oliver's face in the doorway. All of it in a great heaving flood. And I cried so hard I could barely breathe, and Helen just sat with me through it and let me, and didn't once make me feel ashamed for any of it. I'll be straight with you. Counseling didn't fix me. There's no fixing this kind of thing. Not really, not the way you fix a tap or a broken bone. A lot of days I'd come out of those sessions feeling absolutely wrecked, scraped raw, like I'd been turning over rocks I'd spent months carefully not looking under. Helen warned me it would be like that. We're not making it hurt, she'd say. The hurt was always there. We're just finding it, so it can stop running the show from the shadows. Some weeks I hated going, but I kept going, putting one foot in front of the other, even when the foot didn't want to move and the floor felt like it might give way. And slowly, so slowly I almost couldn't see it happening, the woman in the mirror started to come back. Not the old me. That woman was gone. You don't survive something like this and stay the same person. And I've made my peace with that. But a new version started to assemble herself out of the wreckage. I started running. I'm still not entirely sure why. I think I needed somewhere to put the restless, awful energy that the betrayal had pumped into me, all that adrenaline with nowhere to go. So I ran. Round the park at first, then further, then I signed up for a marathon, half out of spite and half out of some desperate need to prove to myself that this body, the body he'd been so careless with, was still mine, still strong, still capable of carrying me 26 miles under my own power. I trained through the dark winter mornings before my shifts, breath clouding in front of me. And on the day of the marathon, Oliver stood at the finish line with a homemade sign. And when I crossed it, I fell into his arms and we both cried, but they were good tears for once. I'd done it. I'd taken a body that had been treated like it didn't matter, and I'd made it do something extraordinary. Daniel never even knew. That was part of the sweetness of it. There was now a whole growing territory in my life that he had no access to, that he'd never hear about, achievements and friendships, and ordinary Tuesday evenings that belonged entirely to me. I had to change gyms in the end. I couldn't keep going to the old one. Every time I pulled into that car park, I'd see the salon next door, the bright window, and my stomach would drop through the floor because somewhere behind that glass was the young woman my husband had thrown our family away for. The thought of accidentally seeing her, of having to share a pavement with her, was unbearable. So I joined a different gym on the other side of town, and the relief of never having to drive past that salon again was its own small act of self-rescue. You learn, in this, to remove the knives from your own path one by one, to stop walking the routes that cut you. I tried traveling too. Took myself off on a couple of trips, places Daniel and I had always said we'd go and never had. I'd sit in a cafe in some foreign city, alone, drinking coffee and watching the world go by, and there'd be this complicated cocktail of feelings. Loneliness, yes, sharp and real, but also a kind of fierce, surprising freedom. No one to consult. No one to compromise with. I could spend the whole day in a museum if I wanted, or sleep in, or eat dinner at 4 in the afternoon. I started to understand, in tiny increments, the thing my colleague Sandra had been trying to tell me all those months ago in the break room. That membership in the First Wives Club, terrible as the initiation was, came with certain unexpected privileges. The whole bed, the whole life, the whole self, handed back to you, no longer divided. I don't know whether Daniel ever actually married her. I genuinely don't. I've no idea whether Chloe is now wearing a ring he bought with money he used to bring home to us, or whether it all fell apart the way so many people in my life confidently predicted it would. I used to spend hours imagining it collapsing, him alone, regretful, realizing what he'd thrown away. Helen helped me see that those fantasies, satisfying as they were just another rope tying me to him. As long as I needed him to suffer, I was still tangled up in his story instead of writing my own. So I let it go. Mostly. I won't pretend I never wonder. But I no longer need to know. Oliver still won't speak to his father. He's an adult. That's his choice to make, and I don't push him either way. Daniel reached out to him a few times, apparently, but our son has no interest, and I understand it completely. Some bridges, once you set fire to them, simply do not get rebuilt, no matter how the person who lit the match feels about it later. Daniel made a series of choices, and the loss of his son's respect was one of the prices, even if he didn't read the price tag at the time. People always think they can have the affair, and keep the family too, hold every card in both hands. They almost never can. Drop a comment below. Do you think they made the right call? My son cutting his father off completely, me refusing to chase the truth about whether the marriage I lost was even built on what I thought it was? I go back and forth on it myself. There are nights I think we were too harsh, and mornings I know we weren't harsh enough. I want to be honest about where I actually am, though, because these stories so often end with a tidy bow, the wronged woman striding off into a triumphant sunrise, fully healed, better than ever. The truth is messier than that. This is still the most painful thing that has ever happened to me. I don't have the words, even now, for how completely it unmade me, how thoroughly he destroyed the version of myself I'd spent 24 years building. Some days I still wake up and the emptiness is right there waiting for me, sitting on my chest like a cat. I still miss him sometimes. Not the man who left, but the man I thought he was, the one who used to bring me tea and go red in the ears. That man may never have fully existed, and I miss him anyway. Grief doesn't care about logic. But here's what I've learned, and it's the only thing I really have to offer at the end of all this. You can be utterly broken and still get up. You can miss someone who hurt you and still be glad they're gone. You can carry a wound that never fully closes and still build a whole life around it. A life with marathons and morning runs and trips to cities you always meant to see, with a son who loves you fiercely and friends who show up in a bed that's entirely your own to sprawl across. Healing isn't the absence of the pain. It's learning to live a good life while carrying it. I never thought this would happen to me. Nobody does. We all believe we're the exception, that our love is the durable kind, and most of the time we never get tested. I got tested and my marriage failed the test, and for a long time I thought that meant I had failed too. I don't think that anymore. He chose to throw away something rare and good, and that choice belongs to him, not to me. I get to keep the good years as good years. I get to keep myself. So yes, I'm a member of the First Wives Club now. I didn't ask to join, and I'd give a great deal to have never qualified. But I've come to understand what Sandra meant with that wry little smile across the break room table all those months ago. It isn't really a club of women who lost their husbands. It's a club of women who survived losing them, who put one foot in front of the other on the days that felt impossible, who got up off the floor of an empty flat and built something new out of the rubble. Membership costs everything, but the women in it are the strongest people I've ever met. And if you told me, on the night he packed his bags and left an empty slot in the toothbrush holder, that I'd one day be proud to count myself among them, I'd never have believed you. But I am. Every day, a little more I am. Hey, we are pushing toward 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and your support is the only reason we are anywhere close. If you're not subscribed, please tap that button. Thanks for making this dream come true.